Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking is Dr. Adam Miglio, Associate Professor of Archaeology, who last time I was with him, he was heading toward Iraq, and we can talk about that more on another occasion, I suppose. But Dr. Miglio, thanks for being a part of our conversation.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, we're going to talk about metaphors. Metaphors. A friend of mine is a philologist, maybe, or a philosopher. He says all of language is metaphorical. There's not a word that's not metaphorical. So anyway, maybe that's too broad. But metaphors we don't live by. That was the topic you sent me, and I love that. So what in the world does that mean exactly?
Well, it's in a tipping of the hand or hat to a book called Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, which is a groundbreaking work in cognitive linguistics, in which they sort of argue what your friend is suggesting, that everything is metaphoric. And I'm really, by inserting that word don't, metaphors we don't live by, I want to emphasize the fact that there are a lot of metaphors that are culturally rooted and bound up. And so sometimes metaphors can be lost in translation, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the example, of course, that I was reflecting on for today is in English, when we talk about it, it's raining cats and dogs. You can know all of the linguistic components of that, what rain and cats and dogs are, but not really understand why it all belongs together.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's cultural or historical rootedness to that.
And I wonder if you actually just translated that word for word into Russian, if that would make any sense at all, or they would say this person has lost his mind or her mind, right?
Right. I couldn't translate it to Russian for you, but in French they would say plus de corps, which is it's raining ropes or cords, and that's how you translate it, right? It's just the colloquial way of doing it, and it's another illustration of how those metaphors, again, it has to do with cultural rootedness,
right?
In terms of their meaning.
And so when you move it out of that culture, things can be lost, and often are lost.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about metaphors a little bit. They pedagogically, as a teacher, and I know you probably can relate to this as well, metaphors are a little bit puzzling, and the beauty of that is that they leave enough room for us to have to work a little bit for the answer and for the meaning. And I think metaphors therefore become important in Scripture because they are trying to tease out active engagement with the text. And they really want us to enter in and not just zone out as we read it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Psalm 23 in this regard. I mean, most people who are listening to this podcast probably know it by heart. Maybe they memorized it, whether they did it so in Spanish or in English. They can recite it, but yet it's full of these really intentional metaphors that do some of what you're talking about here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are two dominant metaphors in this beautiful poem, which is just so well beloved for so many different reasons. The first is perhaps the most familiar, the Lord is my shepherd, Adonai Ro'i. And that really tracks through the first four verses in the poem or the psalm. I don't want to say a lot about that one. I think it's the better known and in some ways perhaps easier to enter into even from a contemporary context. I would note just one less obvious thing about this metaphor before moving to the second one in the psalm, and that's that shepherds were a symbol of kingship. And so to speak of Yahweh as a shepherd is to hint at this idea of kingship. And it's even something that we see that the poet is hinting even more directly at in verse 4 when he tells us that this shepherd wields a shevet, often translated rod, but it's also the word for a scepter, right? And there's a double meaning there where you can begin to see the poet kind of tipping just a little bit his hand so you can see this theme of kingship begin to emerge in the seams
Well,
so to speak.
that's a little strategic ambiguity built in there, right?
It is a little bit, absolutely. There is some delightful ambiguity there.
The shepherd's rod sort of turning in his hand, and when you look the second time, it's a scepter, right?
Absolutely.
I love that. I love that kind of image. Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
The second metaphor in the psalm, though, really picks up in verse 5, and it's a little bit perhaps less familiar. And so I want to linger on it just for a second more. In verse 5, the metaphor shifts from shepherd to the metaphor of Yahweh as a host.
Yeah.
A host at a meal. And famously, of course, in Hebrew, it's Ta'arok Lifnai Shulchan Neged Sorori. He arranges before me a table in the presence of my enemies, in the midst of my enemies, or you spread out before me a table in the presence of my enemies. And that image of Yahweh as a host is evocative in ways that are often overlooked. When we think of hosts today at meals, we have certain ideas. We think of hospitality, home-cooked food. In the Near East, the host par excellence was the king. And that's important because it's bringing back that idea of kingship in a subtle but culturally appropriate way. So royal inscriptions in the Near East depict the largesse of kings, able to furnish abundant provisions for their troops. And royal inscriptions, they do some chest pounding, and there's bravado about how much they're able to provide and lavish at meals for their dependents. And so Psalm 23, I think, is doing the same thing. It's wanting to sort of tell us about what kind of king we have. He's a king who cares like a shepherd. He's a king who's lavishly able to provide for his people.
So some wonderful metaphors that we don't live by because we don't really, not everybody has a king these days. And not everybody throws those kind of lavish dinner parties that you can describe.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it'd be interesting to see how we could take those metaphors and translate them into our culture. Maybe that'll be a future podcast with us.
I think that's a wonderful task to translate ancient truths into messages of contemporary relevance.
Yeah. Dr. Adam Miglio, Associate Professor of Archaeology, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us to produce this podcast. Thanks as well to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, the best place you could do that is Wheaton College. They have an amazing program, one of the best I've ever seen, whether you want to be a graduate or an undergraduate student. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.